My Aunt Ophelia bought me my first Harry Potter book at the little local bookstore of my tiny town when I was the same age as Harry in the books. I often say that I grew up with Harry Potter, and many from my generation can relate. My aunt, bless her, would take me to the bookstore and help me choose books to read over the summer. Often she would encourage me to choose a Newbery Award winning novel like Island of the Blue Dolphins or from the mixed up files of Miss Basil E. Frankweiler. After I read the book, she would pick me up in her Jeep Cherokee and take me out for a sweet coffee so that we could discuss the book. It didn't feel pedagogical or made up. It was fun. It was just like talking to my aunt about the most interesting things in the world. Indeed, I look back as an adult and thank my lucky stars that I had such an aunt. To this day, I read books and derive so much pleasure and joy from discussing them with others. So when my aunt bought me the Harry Potter book, I went home and began reading them, and I immediately found myself, like so many others, enthralled. The books were not only well written and fun, there seemed to be something more in their pages. While I identified with the main character, Harry, I soon found myself relating to so many of the other characters of the book. I would get to the end of one book and lament that I had to wait for JK Rowling to write the next one. I think I read The Goblet of Fire over one weekend of nonstop reading. And so, for those of you who do not know, the books tell the story that our modern world is inhabited by witches and wizards who have their own society that is hidden from us by means of magic. Some children are born with magical abilities and others are not. So, some witches and wizards are born to non magical families, which are known as muggles, and sometimes muggles are born to witches and wizards. These books focus on Harry, whose wizard and witch parents are killed by an evil wizard. And during the attack, baby Harry somehow survives, and his survival seems to somehow drive the evil wizard into hiding and out of power. Harry is sent to live with his muggle relatives who conceal this information from him. His adoptive family make him sleep under the stairs, and they are very cruel to him. But when he turns 11 years old, he learns he is a wizard and he is sent to Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Now, I will try not to spoil it for you all, although at this point you would be hard pressed not to know some of the highlights of the Harry Potter books, as ubiquitous as they are in our modern life. The books preach that the strongest magic in the world is the power of love. But there is so much more. Over 4,100 pages of the 7 books, there is this rich world of characters, places, and people, such that it would take too long to even begin to summarize the magic of Luna Lovegood or the sadness of Argus Filch. The books, they deal with grief and loss, and love and anger, PTSD and abuse, and so much that they are not merely fantasy or coming of age, but books in which the many people of my generation really felt through these concepts in a work of fiction. And what's more is that there is a certain sort of comfort in the books. Many people find that they escape to Hogwarts when the world is too overwhelming. It is a place of comfort, it's a soothing place. And as everything in the modern world, there is a massive amount of commercialism and consumer trade in the Harry Potter universe. But I would argue that this trade is parasitic upon the powerful connection that people have with the books. And it's not the consumerism which creates this powerful connection. The books have helped people come out or even understand themselves. Through the character of Luna Lovegood, some people on the autism spectrum have found love and acceptance. Through the character of Hagrid, some recognize a trans woman. The book created a community who have now talked about the books for years, treating the characters as real, existing people, just existing somewhere else. There's even a popular podcast created by 2 Harvard Divinity School students called Harry Potter and the Sacred Text, where they apply methods of thinking from religious traditions to the text of Harry Potter. And this podcast actually has gone on to inspire many people to go to seminary, actually causing one Harvard Divinity School professor to claim that it was the worst thing that ever happened to the school. So you should understand that in my small town in the middle of Colorado, I did not appear exactly normal. Then again, I probably did not appear exactly normal just about anywhere else I went. Being a trans kid in the small town in which I grew up, I had no words nor abilities to describe what I was experiencing. In the mid 1990s, words like transgender, non binary, gender non conforming, these words didn't exist. These concepts were not treated as they are now. The only images or conversation around trans people were humiliating depictions of social pariahs. So the feelings that I had, my attraction to styles and modes of being of the so-called opposite sex, could only lead to humiliation and social exclusion. When we don't have language to express our being, we begin to feel hopeless. That part of me that yearned to express itself felt as though it was the worthless part of me, the part that made me unlovable. And I should clarify that once I was given the language, many years later, too many years really, as an adult, I was able to define myself and be in conversation with myself. So to me, the term trans is an umbrella that captures identities outside of the traditional binary, though often it is used only as an expression of trans women or trans men. I identify as non-binary or gender non-conforming, meaning that I do not identify strongly with either male or female, but I embrace both, and I express both in varying degrees of intensity on any given day. But as a preteen and a teen, it would be unimaginable that I would ever live a life where I could say that and be accepted by society. So I would walk right up to the gender binary line, wearing clothes traditionally set aside for women, but ambiguously. If I wore a dress, it was in theater as mock play. Indeed, I was even banned from wearing the dress from the play Hello Dolly, so fed up was the teacher with my antics. Or I would wear women's jeans or a blouse that would look kinda hippie-ish. Nothing overt, but right on the line. And through all of that, I read myself into the Harry Potter stories. I actually had secret magical powers, and there was a community out there somewhere that I could find who would accept me fiercely. I could read myself into the character of Luna, dream of being the character Tonks, who could literally change her appearance at will. Years later, I found the comedian Eddie Izzard, who is a wonderful trans comedian, who would describe her ability to shift between her male and female identities as a superpower. The Harry Potter world again and again affirmed the value of fierce acceptance and the steadfast fight toward justice. Harry and his friends could love Hagrid even though he was a half giant. So surely there was a place in the world for me. So when JK Rowling, the book's author, made several statements which erased trans identities or which stigmatized trans women as predatory, you can imagine the gut punch that delivered. The person who created the world in which so many of us found the courage and the language to be our full selves was using her platform to spread half-truths and hurtful statements against us. Even when she was confronted with the evidence and the outrage from her fans and collaborators, she continued to make these statements. Her books so effectively championed love and the disillusion of simple binaries, and she seemed to be disavowing her own principles. Binaries always have within them an implicit hierarchy and power structure. God versus creatures, human versus animals, white versus black, men versus women, yes, even witch versus muggle. The term on top determines the contours and edges of the binary. Creatures are everything that is not God. Black is everything that is not white. Women are everything that is not men. The dominant form sets the norm of the binary, It leads the conversation as to what is admitted to its side of the binary and what is other. When I grew up, and I'm sure many of you remember this, it was very common to refer to people to men or man when we were speaking of all of humanity. So, for instance, the Declaration of Independence reads that all men are created equal. Now, I was told as a child that this was just an artful way of saying all people, though this much life experience does lead me to believe that the founding fathers really did mean that men were created equal. But this rendering of men to refer to all people belies another point, that all who are not men are just deficient men or just ill-formed men. And men in this formulation does not mean biological men, for indeed, effeminacy in men in this worldview is a perverse giving up of one's natural birthright, and non-binary or trans people are an unthinkable violation of the order of nature, or masculine women are suspicious usurpers. The formulation of man versus woman as the natural order of things brings with it a whole set of assumptions that are often not plumbed when making the point. Indeed, JK Rowling mocked the term people who menstruate, implying that the appropriate word for people who menstruate is women, completely erasing the existence of several women beyond the trans community, people who have had medical procedures, people of a certain age, people with certain diseases, and yes, trans and non-binary people. This is because JK Rowling has inherited and is perpetuating a worldview that says that the only experience in the world is man or woman, and it is up to us as we try to live into it. But those categories are the only categories. In JK Rowling's telling of feminism, feminism is under attack from the patriarchy and from trans people whose gains are a setback for feminist values. She has chosen to hold on to the rigid gender binary which created the need for a feminism at all, instead of seeing any who challenge the existence of the gender binary as fellow travelers and fellow advocates. Advances in equality lift us all up. Wheelchair ramps made our world safe for our friends and soon-to-be friends. They helped some who never thought they would need to use a wheelchair. And they help mothers with strollers and mail carriers with heavy packages. Advances in equity lift us all up. And if we view advances in equity as hostile to us, it is probably because we are benefiting from the system of inequity. And having those feelings does not make you bad. The world is a hard place in which to live and love, and it so often hurts us, especially the most vulnerable of us. We naturally want to hold on to the advances that we have made, even at times at the expense of others. And it is important that we recognize these feelings, that we are honest about these feelings, so that we can find a way to make sure that we are living into our values of universal love. Feminism challenged the male-dominated binary not so as to create a new binary where women were the dominant term, at least no feminism that I would subscribe to, but to blow up that binary. Advances in equity lift us all up. The fight for trans rights creates a space beyond the patriarchy, as does the fight for women's rights, because the fight is one and the same. Equity beyond the binary and its toxic impositions, which are literally killing us. The fight for trans rights is the fight for women's rights. The fight for women's rights is the fight for trans rights, and it has always been, even if only invisibly. Now, JK Rowling's comments in retrospect should not necessarily have shocked us. In a world where she can embrace wizards and goblins, dragons and mermaids, in a world where she can celebrate and hold werewolves and enslaved house elves, there is not a single mention of a non-cisgender straight person. There is no gay couple, no lesbian couple, no hint of an asexual person, not a single mention of a trans or non-binary person. Some will say that that sort of talk is inappropriate for a young adult fiction, but this series deals with child abuse, the murder of a peer at the hands of an adult, facing one's own mortality, the grief of loss and the anger of grief. Living into our own being is just as vital to understand it and explore as are these concepts. Indeed, many young people reading these books are likely dealing with issues of sexuality and gender as it is. But how do we relate to a work of fiction where the author disappoints us? Some people gave up on the whole series in its entirety. So hurt were they at her comments and attacks. One particularly poignant example was a super collector of all things Harry Potter, who spent 20 years collecting every piece of marketable merchandise. That person sold their entire collection and gave the money to trans-inclusive nonprofits. JK Rowling's statements offered the opportunity for fan communities to stand up and support the trans and non-binary community vocally and powerfully, showing that the assumed inclusivity was true regardless the author's statements. The community embodied the fundamental principle of the books, which is that tolerance is not enough. We must have fierce love and acceptance. And what at first blush appears to be a tragic aspect of the books, that JK Rowling never includes or represents anyone as explicitly being outside of the gender binary, is actually a blessing. For we have been given the text, which is totally outside of JK Rowling. We do not need her opinions. She is just one reader among many. And because the text does not actually espouse her transphobic views, we are able to read our own lives into the book. The creation is always beyond the creator, outside the creator. Children grow into the humans that they are going to be in and beyond the desires of their parents. The books constantly reinforce the message of fierce acceptance and hope. And one definition of hope, which is put forward by the Episcopal priest Matthew Potts, is that hope is feeling you're worth something even when the world is telling you that you are worthless. Harry Potter lived in a cupboard under the stairs in a loveless and abusive family, and unbeknownst to him, there was a community out there who loved him and who could not wait to embrace him. That is the hope that was given to me as a child struggling with my relationship to my own gender identity, and that is the hope that it gave to so many from my generation. The author's comments cannot take that hope away because that community does exist, even if it has to exist against her. And this is the magic that no one can take away. May we all be so blessed to find our loving community and to be our loving community in solidarity, fierce acceptance, and love. May it be so, and amen. So as in place of a benediction, the Harry Potter books have a map which can only be read by those who know the secret way into the map. And when they close it, they use the phrase, "mischief managed." Thank you all.